At the annual family dinner celebrating my father's retirement, he raised his glass and declared that some children are investments that pay dividends while others are simply expenses that drain resources. Everyone laughed and looked at my brother with pride. Then they looked at me with pity. I smiled, finished my water and walked out, leaving behind the designer handbag I had bought my mother that she would never know cost me 3 months of savings. 2 weeks later, when my father called asking me to co-sign the loan for my brother's fourth failed business venture, he discovered that my signature was no longer available, my phone number had changed, and the daughter he had publicly declared worthless had quietly become someone he could no longer afford to lose. Stay with me because this story is about what happens when the child everyone underestimated stops subsidizing the fantasy that surrounded the one everyone overestimated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The restaurant my father had chosen for his retirement celebration was one of those establishments where the prices are not printed on the menu, and the waitstaff speaks in hushed, reverent tones. It was located in the financial district of the city, surrounded by glass towers that reflected the afternoon sun in blinding sheets of light. The private dining room he had reserved seated 20 people comfortably, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the harbor where sailboats drifted lazily across water that sparkled like scattered diamonds. The table was set with crisp white linens, crystal glassware that caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the walls, and floral centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I had arrived exactly on time, which meant I was among the first family members to enter the private dining room. My father was already there, of course, standing near the windows with a glass of scotch in his hand, surveying his domain with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had orchestrated his life exactly according to plan. He was a tall man with silver hair that he wore slightly longer than was fashionable, dressed in an expensive suit that had been tailored to accommodate the weight he had gained in recent years without appearing ill-fitting. He had spent 35 years in corporate finance, climbing steadily through the ranks until he reached a senior vice president position at a wealth management firm, where he advised clients with the kind of money that most people could not realistically imagine. My mother fluttered around the room making unnecessary adjustments to place settings that had already been perfectly arranged by the restaurant staff. She wore a dress I did not recognize, something new and expensive in a shade of coral that complemented her carefully maintained blonde hair. She had spent her adult life as a corporate executive's wife, a role she had embraced with the kind of dedication that some people bring to actual careers. She managed their social calendar, decorated their home to reflect my father's status, and maintained the appearance of a family that existed primarily for external consumption rather than internal connection. I had brought a gift for my mother, even though this was ostensibly my father's celebration. It was a designer handbag from a brand she had mentioned admiring, something I had saved for over 3 months to afford. I worked as a social worker specializing in family services, a career that paid modestly despite requiring a master's degree, and involving emotionally exhausting work with vulnerable populations. My salary was sufficient for my needs and allowed me to live independently in a small apartment across town, but it did not provide much room for luxury purchases. The handbag represented a significant sacrifice, but I had wanted to give my mother something that would please her, something that might earn a moment of genuine appreciation, rather than the vague acknowledgement that usually greeted my efforts. I placed the carefully wrapped box on the gift table near the entrance and moved to greet my parents. My father barely glanced at me, offering a distracted nod before returning his attention to the harbor view. My mother accepted my kiss on her cheek while simultaneously scanning the room for some detail that required her intervention. Neither asked about my work, my life, or how I had been in the weeks since we had last seen each other at a brief and awkward Sunday brunch. This lack of curiosity was so familiar that I barely registered it anymore. The way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator after living with it for years. My brother Daniel arrived 20 minutes late, which was actually early by his standards. He entered the room with the kind of confident energy that some people naturally possess and others spend their lives trying to cultivate. Daniel was 2 years younger than me, handsome in the effortless way of people who have never doubted their own appeal, dressed in expensive casual clothes that managed to look both relaxed and carefully curated. He worked in tech, or more accurately, he moved through a series of startup ventures that he described as working in tech. Each venture began with tremendous enthusiasm and optimistic projections, attracted investors through Daniel's natural charisma and my father's connections, and eventually collapsed under the weight of poor planning, inadequate execution, or simple bad luck that Daniel always managed to frame as unforeseeable circumstances rather than predictable consequences of his approach. My father's face transformed when Daniel entered the room. The distracted executive expression was replaced by genuine warmth and pride. He crossed the room to embrace his son, clapping him on the back with real affection. My mother immediately migrated toward Daniel as well, adjusting his collar and smoothing his hair despite the fact that he was a 29-year-old man who presumably could manage his own appearance. The two of them orbited around Daniel like planets around the sun, asking about his latest venture, listening with rapt attention to his explanations of market opportunities and growth potential, nodding with approval at his vision and ambition. I watched this familiar scene from my position near the windows, feeling the old mixture of resignation and something sharper that I did not quite allow myself to name. Daniel caught my eye and winked at me with the easy affection of someone who had never questioned his position as the favored child. There was no malice in it, which somehow made it worse. He genuinely did not understand that the family dynamics that elevated him necessarily diminished me. He moved through the world assuming that everyone received the kind of automatic approval and support that had been granted to him since birth, unable to recognize that his experience was not universal even within his own family. The rest of the family arrived in clusters over the next 30 minutes. My father's brother and his wife, my mother's sister and her husband, several of my parents' longtime friends from their country club and professional circles, a few colleagues from my father's firm. My father's parents had both passed away years earlier, but my mother's mother was there, a sharp-eyed woman in her 80s who observed family dynamics with the kind of clear perception that comes from having lived through enough years to recognize patterns that others remained oblivious to. She greeted me with more warmth than my own parents had shown, holding my hand for a moment longer than necessary and looking at me with an expression I could not quite interpret. We were eventually called to take our seats at the long table. The seating arrangement was not accidental, though my mother would have claimed it was simply a matter of fitting everyone comfortably. My father sat at the head of the table with my mother to his right. Daniel sat to my father's left in the position traditionally reserved for the guest of honor at these kinds of events. I was seated near the opposite end of the table, positioned between my uncle's wife who I barely knew and one of my father's colleagues who I had never met. This physical arrangement perfectly reflected the family hierarchy. Daniel close to the center of attention and power, me relegated to the periphery where I could be technically present without actually being included in anything meaningful. The meal proceeded through multiple courses, each dish carefully prepared and artfully presented. Conversations fragmented into smaller exchanges, with the most animated discussions clustered around my father and Daniel, while the far end of the table made polite small talk about weather, traffic, and other safe topics that required no real engagement. I found myself answering rote questions about my work from my uncle's wife, who listened with the glassy-eyed expression of someone being polite rather than interested. When I asked her questions in return, following the basic rules of conversation that dictate reciprocal interest, she answered in monosyllables before her attention drifted back toward the more interesting conversations happening at the other end of the table. Dessert was served as the sun began setting over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I had been in any condition to appreciate them. My father stood, tapping his knife against his crystal water glass to call for attention. The room quieted immediately, all faces turning toward him with expressions of anticipation. He was a man accustomed to commanding attention in professional settings, and he brought that same expectation of deference to family gatherings. He began with the expected remarks about gratitude for the attendance, acknowledgement of his long career, reflections on the satisfaction of reaching retirement age with financial security, and a lifetime of professional accomplishments behind him. He thanked my mother for her support throughout his career, framing her role in language that made her sound like a particularly efficient personal assistant, rather than a life partner. He acknowledged friends and colleagues, making small jokes that demonstrated his wit, and kept the audience engaged. Then he shifted his focus to children and legacy, themes he approached with the confidence of someone who believed his perspectives were not only correct but universally applicable. He talked about the purpose of building wealth, which he framed primarily as providing advantages for the next generation. He discussed the satisfaction of seeing his investments, both financial and personal, generate returns. And then he said the words that would fracture whatever remained of my relationship with my family into pieces too small to ever reassemble. Some children are investments that pay dividends, he declared. His voice carrying the authoritative tone he had perfected over decades of making pronouncements in boardrooms. They take what you give them and multiply it, building on the foundation you provide to create success that reflects well on the entire family. These are the children who make you rich in ways that go beyond money, who validate your choices and prove that your guidance produced exactly the outcomes you intended. He paused, letting this statement settle while people nodded in agreement. Then he continued with what he clearly believed was balanced perspective rather than devastating contrast. And then there are children who are simply expenses, he said with a slight smile that suggested this was meant as gentle humor rather than harsh judgment. They consume resources without generating returns. They require constant support without ever reaching a point of self-sufficiency that allows them to contribute back to the family wealth, either literally or figuratively. These children cost money and emotional energy without ever providing the satisfaction of seeing your investment bear fruit. The room reacted with uncomfortable laughter, the kind of nervous sound that people make when someone says something arguably inappropriate, but they are uncertain whether they are supposed to acknowledge the inappropriateness or go along with the joke. My father let the laughter build for a moment, clearly pleased with his observation. Then he turned toward Daniel with unmistakable pride and raised his glass in a toast. To Daniel he said warmly, "My investment that has paid dividends beyond anything I could have projected. You have taken every advantage we provided and turned it into something remarkable. You embody the entrepreneurial spirit and ambitious vision that makes me proud to be your father. Whatever success I achieved in my career pales in comparison to the satisfaction of seeing you pursue your dreams with courage and determination." The table erupted in applause. Daniel stood to acknowledge the toast, looking genuinely moved by my father's words. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. People reached over to shake Daniel's hand or pat his shoulder in congratulation. The celebration was complete and unambiguous. Daniel was the child who made his parents rich in pride, validation, and reflected glory. And then, because the contrast needed to be made explicit rather than merely implied, my father turned his attention down the table toward where I sat. His expression shifted from pride to something more complicated, a mixture of disappointment and resignation that he probably believed looked like sympathetic understanding. "And to Claire," he said, my voice barely carrying over the residual conversation, "we love you, of course, but I think we can all acknowledge that social work was not exactly the return on investment I was hoping for when I paid for your education." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The laughter that followed was different from before, sharper and more pointed. It was not the nervous laughter of people uncertain how to respond. It was the knowing laughter of people who believed they understood the joke and agreed with its premise. I watched faces around the table registering amusement, sympathy, or simple relief that they were not the ones being positioned as the disappointing child, the expense without returns, the investment that failed to appreciate. I felt something very specific happen in that moment, something I would later recognize as a fundamental shift in how I understood my relationship with these people. It was not anger, though anger would come later. It was not even hurt, though hurt was certainly present beneath the surface. It was clarity. Sudden, complete, undeniable clarity about dynamics I had been making excuses for my entire life. My father had just announced to 20 people in an expensive restaurant overlooking the harbor that I was a disappointment, a financial burden, a child who cost money without generating returns. He had done this while celebrating my brother's presumed success, creating explicit contrast that left no room for misinterpretation. And everyone in the room had either laughed in agreement or remained silent in complicity, which amounted to the same thing. I looked at my mother, hoping for some indication that she would contradict this characterization or defend me in even the smallest way. She avoided my eyes, busying herself with her napkin and her water glass, choosing comfort over courage the way she had chosen it throughout my childhood whenever my father's harsh judgments had targeted me. I looked at my grandmother, who was staring at my father with an expression of such disappointment that it briefly warmed something in my chest, but she did not speak either, perhaps recognizing that any defense of me would be dismissed as elderly sentimentality rather than valid perspective. I carefully folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I stood up with movements that felt remarkably calm given the adrenaline coursing through my system. Multiple pairs of eyes tracked my movement with varying degrees of interest and concern. My father paused mid-sentence in whatever he had been saying next, looking at me with mild confusion as if I were a guest who had rudely interrupted rather than his daughter who had just been publicly humiliated. I did not make a scene. I did not deliver the devastating speech that was forming in my mind, cataloging every double standard, every unfair comparison, every time my accomplishments had been minimized while Daniel's failures had been reframed as learning experiences. I did not list the specific dollar amounts I had given to family members over the years when they needed help, the countless hours I had spent providing free therapy-adjacent emotional support to relatives in crisis, the ways I had subordinated my own needs to maintain family peace. Instead, I simply said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room, "I need to leave now. I will not be available for future family events. I wish you all well." I walked toward the exit with my purse in hand, my steps measured and steady. As I passed the gift table, I briefly considered taking back the designer handbag I had saved 3 months to afford, but I left it there. Let my mother open it later and realize what it had cost me. Let her try to reconcile that sacrifice with my father's characterization of me as nothing more than an expense. Let the cognitive dissonance create whatever discomfort it would create. The private dining room door closed behind me with a soft click that somehow felt more definitive than a slam would have been. I walked through the main restaurant where other diners were enjoying their meals in blissful ignorance of family drama, through the elegant lobby, and out into the evening air that had cooled considerably since I had arrived hours earlier. The sun had fully set now, leaving the city illuminated by streetlights and the glowing windows of office buildings where people were still working despite the late hour. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, breathing in the salt air that drifted up from the harbor, feeling my heart rate slowly returning to normal. My phone began buzzing in my purse almost immediately, but I did not look at it. I knew what I would find. Messages from family members telling me I was overreacting, that my father had not meant anything by his comments, that I was being too sensitive and ruining what should have been a special celebration, that I should come back inside and apologize for causing a scene. But I had not caused the scene. I had simply refused to sit through it with a smile on my face, pretending that public humiliation was affection, that devastating comparisons were jokes, that being characterized as worthless was something I should accept gracefully because it came from family. I had spent 31 years playing that game, and in the space of a single dinner I had decided I was done playing it. I walked to my car, got in, and drove home through streets that felt simultaneously familiar and completely transformed, as if I were seeing my city for the first time despite having lived here my entire life. By the time I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, I had made several decisions that would change the trajectory of my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. I would not be answering my family's calls or messages. I would not be attending future family events. I would not be providing financial support, emotional labor, or any other form of assistance to people who saw me as nothing more than an expense, a disappointment, a failed investment. And most importantly, I would stop allowing their assessment of my worth to have any bearing whatsoever on my assessment of my own worth. Because I knew something they apparently did not, my value had never been dependent on their recognition of it, and my success had never required their validation. I had simply been looking for that validation in the wrong place for far too long, paying an enormous emotional price for seeking acceptance from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. That night, I sat in my small apartment that my family had always viewed with thinly veiled disappointment, surrounded by the life I had built through my own efforts, and felt something I had not expected to feel in the aftermath of such a painful experience. I felt free. The chains I had not even fully recognized I was wearing had been broken not by my choice but by my father's words, and now that they were broken, I discovered I had no intention of ever allowing them to be reforged. Whatever happened next, it would happen to a version of myself who was no longer willing to accept treatment that contradicted my fundamental dignity and worth. And that version of myself, it turned out, was someone I was very interested in getting to know better. The first week following my departure from the retirement dinner existed in a strange suspended state where time seemed to move both too quickly and too slowly. My apartment became a sanctuary where I could process what had happened without the immediate pressure of family contact or social obligation. I had silenced notifications from my family members within hours of arriving home that first night, and the resulting quiet created space for reflection that I had not experienced in years. During the day, I continued with my work responsibilities at the Family Services Agency where I had been employed for 6 years, conducting intake assessments with new clients, facilitating support groups for parents navigating the child welfare system, and writing case notes that documented the complex circumstances of families in crisis. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, requiring emotional presence and professional boundaries in equal measure, but it also provided structure and purpose that grounded me during this period of personal upheaval. In the evenings, however, I began a different kind of work. I started systematically reviewing my relationship with my family, not through the lens of nostalgia or wishful thinking, but with the analytical skills I had developed through years of assessing family dynamics professionally. I realized with some irony that I had been using those skills to help clients identify dysfunction in their own families, while remaining somehow blind to the patterns operating in my own. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that blindness had been exhausting in ways I was only now beginning to recognize. I began with my digital records, opening my laptop and navigating through years of emails, text messages, and financial transactions. The evidence was overwhelming once I allowed myself to actually see it rather than explaining it away. I found dozens of requests from family members for various forms of assistance stretching back through my entire adult life. My brother Daniel had contacted me 11 times over the past 3 years, asking for loans that totaled nearly $18,000. Each request had been framed as temporary, a bridge loan that would be repaid within months once his latest venture started generating revenue. I scrolled through my banking records and confirmed what I already knew but had not wanted to acknowledge. Not a single dollar had ever been repaid. When I had tentatively mentioned repayment in a few instances, Daniel had responded with hurt confusion, suggesting that I was being mercenary about family relationships and that surely I understood his cash flow challenges were temporary. My parents had their own pattern of requests that appeared more subtle but were equally consistent. My father, despite his comfortable retirement accounts and investment portfolio, had asked me to cover costs for family gatherings on multiple occasions, always with the explanation that I should want to contribute to family events and that my reluctance suggested a lack of appreciation for everything they had provided me. My mother had presented various needs over the years, usually framed as emergencies that required immediate financial response. Unexpected medical expenses that her insurance somehow did not cover, home repairs that could not wait, gifts for relatives that she could not afford but felt obligated to provide. I had responded to each request, draining my savings repeatedly to meet needs that I was increasingly recognizing might not have been as urgent as they had been presented. But it was not just the financial exploitation that the records revealed. I found email threads where I had shared professional accomplishments, promotions, successful outcomes with particularly challenging cases, recognition from my supervisors or colleagues, only to receive responses that were perfunctory at best and dismissive at worst. My mother typically responded with single-sentence acknowledgments that managed to convey both minimal interest and subtle criticism. My father often did not respond at all, or replied days later with some version of "that is nice dear" before redirecting conversation toward Daniel's latest activities. In contrast, I found extensive threads celebrating Daniel's ventures. Each new business idea generated enthusiastic responses from both parents, detailed questions about his plans, offers of connection to people in their networks who might be helpful, and expressions of pride in his ambition and vision. When his ventures failed, as they invariably did, the email threads showed my parents offering comfort, financial assistance, and reframing of the failure as a learning experience or the result of circumstances beyond Daniel's control. The double standard was so consistent and so pronounced that I could not understand how I had failed to recognize it for what it was. I moved from digital records to physical ones, pulling out boxes from my closet that contained cards, letters, and photographs from throughout my life. I spread them across my living room floor and began organizing them chronologically, creating a visual timeline of my family relationships. What emerged was a pattern that had been operating since my childhood, so consistent that it had the weight of inevitability rather than choice. Birthday cards from my parents to Daniel were effusive, multiple pages of handwritten text, celebrating his personality, his potential, his importance to them. My birthday cards were purchased rather than handmade, contained brief generic sentiments, and often arrived days late if they arrived at all. Photographs from family vacations and holidays showed Daniel centered in most images, with my parents positioned beside him in ways that communicated closeness and pride. I appeared in far fewer photos, usually positioned at the edges of group shots or absent entirely because I had been the one taking the picture. I found my high school diploma and college degree stored in a folder with various other documents, treated like paperwork that needed to be kept for record-keeping purposes, rather than achievements worthy of display. I knew without needing to confirm that Daniel's community college transcripts from the single semester he had attended before dropping out were framed and displayed in my parents' home office, positioned where visitors would see them. The transcripts showed mediocre grades and multiple incomplete courses, but they were presented as evidence of his intellectual capacity and academic potential that was simply too constrained by traditional educational structures. Report cards from my childhood told a story I had forgotten or perhaps had never fully understood. I had been an excellent student, consistently earning high marks and teacher comments praising my work ethic, creativity, and intellectual curiosity. But I found no evidence that these achievements had generated pride or celebration from my parents. There were no cards congratulating me on honor roll designation, no special dinners to celebrate academic awards, no conversations about my potential or my future. My success had been expected and therefore unremarkable, something that required no particular acknowledgement because it was simply what I was supposed to do. Daniel's report cards painted a different picture. His grades were inconsistent, ranging from high marks in subjects that interested him to failing grades in subjects he found boring. His teacher comments frequently mentioned unfocused behavior, incomplete assignments, and failure to apply himself to his potential. Yet I found evidence that my parents had responded to these mediocre results with concern, attention, and intervention. They had hired tutors, met with teachers, explored whether Daniel might have learning differences that required accommodation, and generally treated his academic struggles as problems worthy of significant parental investment. The message was clear. Daniel's failures generated concern and support, while my successes generated nothing because they were merely baseline expectations. I found journals I had kept during high school and college, something I had not looked at in over a decade. Reading them now with adult perspective and professional training in family systems, I saw patterns that my younger self had observed but lacked the framework to understand. I wrote repeatedly about feeling invisible, about accomplishments that went unacknowledged, about the contrast between how my parents responded to me versus how they responded to Daniel. But I also wrote about my determination to try harder, to achieve more, to finally do something significant enough that my parents would have to notice and celebrate me the way they celebrated my brother. The younger version of myself who had written those entries believed that the problem was her insufficient achievement rather than her parents' incapacity for equitable recognition. She believed that if she just worked hard enough, succeeded thoroughly enough, proved her worth convincingly enough, she would finally earn the validation she craved. Reading those entries now, I felt tremendous compassion for that girl who had been trying so hard to win a game that was rigged from the start. The goalposts would always move because the issue was never really about my achievements. The issue was that my parents had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that Daniel was the child worthy of their full investment of attention, pride, and support, which meant I would necessarily be the child who received whatever scraps remained after his needs had been met. I thought about my career choice through this new lens and recognized dynamics I had not previously connected. I had been drawn to social work partly because of genuine passion for helping vulnerable families, but also because some part of me had been trying to prove my worth through service to others. If I could not earn my family's pride through personal achievement, perhaps I could earn it through selfless dedication to helping others. The irony was that my family had viewed my career choice with disappointment rather than pride, seeing it as evidence of limited ambition rather than admirable values. My father, in particular, had made numerous comments over the years about wasted potential, about how my intelligence could have been applied to more lucrative fields, about his confusion regarding why I would choose a career that would never provide financial security or social status. I realized that I had also been unconsciously recreating family dynamics in my professional life. I worked with families where children were undervalued, overlooked, or treated as burdens rather than blessings. I advocated fiercely for those children, fought systems that failed to protect them, and provided support that helped parents recognize and change harmful patterns. I was doing for my clients' children what no one had done for me, offering the validation and advocacy that I wished someone had offered on my behalf. The work was meaningful and I did not regret the career choice, but I needed to acknowledge the personal wounds that had partly motivated that choice. My phone continued to accumulate unread messages and missed calls throughout that first week, the numbers climbing daily. I did not read or listen to any of them because I knew they would contain the predictable mix of manipulation tactics, minimization of what had happened, insistence that I was overreacting, demands that I apologize for causing embarrassment, guilt-inducing messages about worrying my elderly grandmother, and probably some threats about consequences if I did not fall back in line. I did not need to consume those messages to know their content, because I had received variations of them throughout my life whenever I had expressed needs or boundaries that inconvenienced the family system. On the 8th day following the dinner, I received an unexpected call from my grandmother on my maternal side, the sharp-eyed woman who had been present at the retirement celebration. Unlike my parents and brother, I had not blocked her number because she had always maintained some degree of independence from the family consensus, and had occasionally offered me small kindnesses that suggested she saw the dynamics more clearly than she acknowledged. I answered the call with some trepidation, uncertain whether she was calling to pressure me to reconcile or whether she had something else to say. Her voice was firm and clear despite her 83 years. "I am not calling to tell you to forgive your father or come back to family events," she said without preamble. "I am calling to tell you that I am proud of you for walking out of that dinner. And I am ashamed that I did not walk out with you. What your father said was cruel and inaccurate, and the fact that everyone laughed or stayed silent makes it worse, not better." I felt tears spring to my eyes at the unexpected validation. I had been bracing for criticism or manipulation, not support and acknowledgement. My grandmother continued speaking, her words measured and deliberate. "I have watched your parents treat you differently than Daniel since you were both children. I told your mother years ago that she was creating a destructive dynamic, but she dismissed my concerns. She said I did not understand modern parenting or that I was projecting issues from my own childhood onto her family. I let it go because I did not want to cause conflict, and that was cowardice on my part." She paused, and I heard her take a breath before continuing. "I want you to know some things about your family history that might help you understand these patterns, though understanding does not excuse them. Your mother was the less favored child in her own family. Her brother was the golden child who could do no wrong while your mother was constantly criticized and found lacking. Instead of learning from that experience and refusing to replicate those patterns with her own children, she internalized the message that families naturally have hierarchies where some children are valued more than others. And she married a man who held those same beliefs." My grandmother went on to share information I had never known about my parents' early relationship, my father's family background where achievement and financial success were the only metrics of worth that mattered, and specific incidents from my childhood that she had witnessed and found concerning but had not felt positioned to address at the time. She described confrontations she had had with my mother over the years about the differential treatment of her grandchildren, conversations that had been dismissed or minimized in ways that eventually caused my grandmother to stop raising the issues directly. The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end I had a much clearer picture of how my family's dysfunction had developed and been maintained across generations. The information was both validating and painful. It confirmed that my perceptions had been accurate, and that the unequal treatment had been as obvious to outside observers as it had felt to me. But it also revealed that the dysfunction was deeply entrenched, rooted in patterns that extended back before my birth, maintained by people who either could not or would not examine their own behavior and its impact on others. Before ending the call, my grandmother said something that shifted my perspective significantly. "You need to understand that you cannot fix this, Claire. I know you are a social worker and you help families change harmful patterns, but that only works when people are willing to acknowledge the patterns and commit to change. Your parents have built their identities around their narrative about their children. Daniel is the successful, ambitious one who validates their parenting and reflects well on them. You are the disappointing, overly sensitive one who does not appreciate what they have provided." Admitting that this narrative is inaccurate and harmful would require them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about themselves, And most people would rather maintain their self-image than acknowledge uncomfortable truths. She was right, and hearing it stated so clearly by someone with both family connection and outside perspective helped me accept what I had been resisting. I could not make my parents see me accurately because they had too much invested in seeing me the way they had decided to see me. Any evidence that contradicted their narrative would be dismissed, minimized, or reinterpreted to preserve their existing beliefs. I had been exhausting myself for 3 decades trying to earn recognition from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it, not because I was unworthy but because they lacked the capacity for the kind of honest reflection that recognition would require. After the call ended, I sat for a long time with my laptop open to a blank document. I began writing everything I could remember about differential treatment, financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and systematic dismissal of my worth and achievements. The document eventually ran to 37 pages, single-spaced, and reading it back left me feeling both devastated and oddly relieved. Devastated because the scope and consistency of the mistreatment was undeniable once I allowed myself to see it fully. Relieved because I no longer needed to question my perceptions or wonder whether I was being unfair in my assessment of family dynamics. I thought about the retirement dinner and my father's declaration that some children are investments while others are expenses. The statement was revealing in ways he had not intended. He had reduced his children to financial instruments, measuring our worth based on return on investment rather than intrinsic value as human beings. By his metric, Daniel was successful because he maintained the appearance of ambition and potential even though his actual outcomes were consistently poor. I was unsuccessful because I had chosen meaningful work over lucrative work, service over status, and authentic living over performance of success. But I knew something my father apparently did not. The real measure of success was not how much money you made, or how impressive your ventures sounded to others. The real measure was whether you lived according to your values, whether you contributed something meaningful to the world, whether you treated people with dignity and respect, and whether you could look at yourself honestly without needing to construct elaborate narratives to maintain your self-image. By those metrics, I was far more successful than either my father or my brother, regardless of whether they would ever recognize it. I closed my laptop and looked around my small apartment, this space that my family had always viewed with barely concealed disappointment. I saw it differently now. Every item in this apartment I had purchased with my own money, earned through work that mattered to me. Every decision about how to arrange and decorate the space reflected my actual preferences, rather than performance for others. Every quiet evening I spent here was free from the constant evaluation and criticism that characterized time with my family. This apartment was not evidence of failure or limited ambition. It was evidence of self-sufficiency, authentic choice, and the ability to create a life that aligned with my values, even without family support or approval. The week of reflection and excavation had been painful but necessary. I now understood not just what had happened at the retirement dinner but why it had happened and how it connected to patterns operating throughout my entire life. I understood that these patterns would not change because they served important functions for my family members, protecting them from uncomfortable self-examination and allowing them to maintain identities built on distorted narratives. And most importantly, I understood that I did not need their narratives to change because I could simply stop participating in them. I could build my life around people and values that honored my actual worth rather than continuing to seek validation from people who were constitutionally incapable of providing it. That realization, once fully accepted, created a foundation for everything that would follow in my journey toward authentic freedom and self-determination. The second Monday after the retirement dinner marked my return to what I had previously considered normal life, though I was increasingly recognizing that normal had been a carefully maintained fiction that required constant effort to sustain. I arrived at the family services agency where I worked at my usual time, carrying my travel mug of coffee and the canvas bag that held my laptop, case files, and the various materials I needed for the day's appointments. The building was a converted school building in a neighborhood that had seen better days, with peeling paint on the exterior and floors that creaked with every step. But the organization did meaningful work with limited resources, and I had always felt proud to be part of it. My colleague and closest friend at the agency, Jessica, was already at her desk when I arrived. She looked up from her computer screen and immediately stood, crossing the small office we shared to embrace me before I had even set down my belongings. "I told you not to go to that dinner," she said, pulling back to look at my face with concern. I knew your father would find some way to make it about Daniel and make you feel small. Are you okay? Jessica was a family therapist who specialized in addiction and recovery, someone I had worked alongside for 4 years, and had gradually developed a friendship with that extended beyond professional collegiality. She was one of the few people I had told about my family dynamics over the years, sharing frustrations during lunch breaks or after particularly difficult days when my emotional reserves were depleted. She had consistently offered perspective that I had not been ready to fully hear, gently pointing out patterns of exploitation and dismissal that I had been explaining away as normal family complexity. I am actually better than I expected to be, I told her honestly as I settled into my desk chair and powered on my computer. Something shifted at that dinner. My father essentially announced to everyone present that I am a disappointment and a financial drain while Daniel is a triumph of parenting. And instead of falling apart or trying to defend myself, I just left. I walked out and I have not spoken to any of them since. Jessica listened as I recounted the details of the dinner, my father's speech about investments and expenses, the laughter from family members, my grandmother's subsequent phone call, and the week I had spent systematically reviewing the history of my family relationships. As I spoke, I watched her professional therapist expression shift through recognition, validation, and something that looked like relief. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment before responding. I am so glad you finally see it, she said carefully. I have been watching you exhaust yourself trying to earn recognition from people who will never provide it, and it has been painful to witness. You are one of the most competent, compassionate, dedicated people I know. The work you do here changes lives. The clients you serve trust you because you actually see them and fight for them. You have built a meaningful career and a good life despite receiving no support from your family. The fact that they cannot recognize your worth says everything about their limitations and nothing about your value. Her words landed with the weight of truth spoken by someone who had observed my struggles from outside the family system, and could therefore see them more clearly than I had been able to see them myself. We talked for another 30 minutes before our first client appointments of the day required our attention, but that conversation marked a shift in how I understood my situation. I was not alone in my perception of what had been happening. I had an ally who validated my experience and supported my decision to establish boundaries, someone who understood both personally and professionally why those boundaries were necessary. The workday proceeded with its usual intensity. I met with a mother whose children had been removed due to neglect allegations, and who was working through the requirements to regain custody. I facilitated a support group for fathers navigating co-parenting after divorce. I consulted with a colleague about a particularly complex case involving suspected abuse. I wrote case notes and returned phone calls and managed the constant small crises that characterized work in an underfunded social services agency. The work required my full attention and provided respite from rumination about my family situation, but it also provided constant reminders of why I had chosen this profession despite its modest compensation and emotional demands. During my lunch break, I finally opened my phone to review the accumulated messages from my family. There were 43 text messages, 17 voicemails, and 12 emails spanning the 9 days since the dinner. I read through them systematically, taking notes on the patterns and tactics being employed. The messages fell into predictable categories that I recognized from my professional training in manipulation and control dynamics. My mother's messages began with concern trolling, expressing worry about my well-being and suggesting that my behavior was so uncharacteristic that perhaps I needed mental health evaluation. When that approach apparently did not generate the desired response, her messages shifted to guilt induction, reminding me of everything she and my father had done for me over the years and suggesting that walking out of the dinner demonstrated profound ingratitude. Her most recent messages had taken on a wounded tone, claiming that I was breaking her heart, and that she did not understand what she had done to deserve such treatment from her daughter. My father's messages were fewer in number but more aggressive in tone. He demanded that I call him immediately to discuss my inappropriate behavior at his retirement celebration. He suggested that I owed him an apology for embarrassing the family in front of friends and colleagues. He referenced the money he had spent on my education and upbringing as evidence that I had obligations to him that I was failing to honor. His final message, sent just that morning, informed me that if I did not respond within 24 hours, he would be forced to conclude that I was intentionally cutting off contact and would respond accordingly, though he did not specify what that response might entail. Daniel's messages occupied a different category. He seemed genuinely confused about what had happened and why I had reacted so strongly to what he characterized as Dad's awkward attempt at humor. He acknowledged that our father could be tactless but suggested that I was taking things too personally, and that family required tolerance of each other's flaws. He mentioned that Mom was really upset, and that my continued silence was causing stress for everyone. His most recent message asked if I needed money, suggesting that perhaps financial stress was making me more sensitive than usual to family dynamics. That final message from Daniel crystallized something important. He genuinely could not conceive that I might be responding to legitimate grievance rather than some external stressor that was distorting my perception. It had never occurred to him that our parents treated us differently, or that their differential treatment might be harmful to me. He moved through the world assuming his experience was universal, unable to recognize that the unconditional support and celebration he received was not something I had ever experienced. His obliviousness was not malicious, but it was comprehensive, and it meant that he could never be an ally in challenging family dysfunction because he literally could not see it. I also found messages from several aunts and uncles who had been present at the dinner, most of them encouraging me to smooth things over with my parents and suggesting that family harmony was more important than whatever had upset me. One aunt sent a particularly lengthy message explaining that parents sometimes said things that were hurtful, but that they always had our best interests at heart and deserved forgiveness and patience. Another uncle suggested that I was at an age where women sometimes became emotional and irrational, and that perhaps I should speak with my doctor about whether hormonal issues might be affecting my mood and judgment. Reading through these messages, I felt my resolve strengthen rather than weaken. Every message demonstrated exactly the dynamics I had decided to extract myself from. Every message prioritized the comfort of my parents and the appearance of family unity over the legitimate harm I had experienced. Every message suggested that I was the problem for having boundaries and expectations, rather than acknowledging that my parents had behaved in ways that violated basic standards of respect and dignity. I drafted a response that I spent the remainder of my lunch break refining. I wanted it to be clear and firm without being defensive or explaining more than was necessary. I did not want to provide ammunition that could be used to characterize me as unstable or overly emotional. I did not want to engage in debate about whether my father's words had been intended as humor, or whether I should have been more tolerant of his communication style. I wanted simply to state my boundaries and the consequences for violating them. The final version read, I am writing to inform you that I will no longer be participating in family gatherings or maintaining regular contact with immediate family members. This decision is based on patterns of treatment that I have tolerated for too long, and that I am no longer willing to accept. Specifically, I will not continue relationships characterized by financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, systematic dismissal of my worth and achievements, and public humiliation. I wish you all well, but I need to prioritize my own well-being and invest my time and energy in relationships that are reciprocal and respectful. Please do not contact me further. Any future communication should come through email only, and I will respond only if the communication relates to genuine emergencies or necessary practical matters. I am not interested in debate about this decision or in explanations about how I have misunderstood situations. My perception of these patterns is based on 3 decades of direct experience, and is not subject to revision through further discussion. I sent the message to my parents, Daniel, and the extended family members who had been pressuring me to reconcile. Then I blocked their phone numbers so that calls and text messages would not come through, leaving only email as a communication channel that I could review on my own timeline, rather than being subjected to immediate demands for response and attention. The act of sending that message felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. I had never directly confronted my family's treatment of me in such explicit terms. I had never stated clearly that I found their behavior unacceptable, and was withdrawing from relationships that harmed me. I had certainly never suggested that the problem was their behavior rather than my insufficient gratitude or excessive sensitivity. The message represented a fundamental rejection of the family narrative, and an assertion that I had the right to define my own experience and establish my own boundaries regardless of whether they agreed with my assessment. Within an hour, my email inbox began filling with responses. I read the subject lines without opening the messages. How could you say these things? You are breaking your mother's heart. We need to talk about your accusations. This is completely unacceptable. I archived them all without reading the full content because I knew they would contain variations of the same themes. Denial of wrongdoing, insistence that I was distorting reality, demands that I retract my statements and apologize, and threats of various consequences if I did not comply. That evening, I met Jessica for dinner at a small restaurant near both our homes. Over pasta and wine, I showed her the message I had sent and the responses I had received. She read through everything carefully before looking up at me with an expression of professional assessment mixed with personal concern. "This is really good," she said, referring to my boundary-setting message. "It is clear without being defensive, firm without being aggressive, and it names specific patterns without getting lost in details that could be debated. The responses are exactly what you should expect from people whose dysfunction you have just named explicitly. They are not going to thank you for the clarity or appreciate your boundaries. They are going to escalate their pressure because you have threatened the system that served their needs." She paused, taking a sip of wine before continuing. "You need to prepare yourself for what comes next. Based on everything you have told me about your family and based on what I know professionally about how family systems respond to disruption, they will likely escalate significantly before they accept that you are serious about these boundaries. They may show up at your apartment unannounced. They may contact your workplace. They may try to recruit mutual friends or your grandmother to pressure you. They may even make threats about consequences like removing you from wills or cutting off contact with extended family members you care about. You need to decide in advance how you will respond to these escalation tactics, so that you are not making decisions in the moment when you are emotionally activated." Her warning proved prescient. 3 days after I sent my boundary-setting message, I came home from work to find my mother sitting in her car in my apartment building's parking lot. She had apparently been waiting for some time, and she got out of the car as soon as she saw me approaching. Her face showed signs of recent crying, and she was dressed in casual clothes that suggested she had driven directly from her home without the usual careful attention to appearance that characterized her public presentation. "Claire, please," she said as I walked toward my building entrance. "We need to talk about this. You cannot just cut off your family over a misunderstanding. Your father did not mean anything hurtful by what he said at the dinner. He was trying to be funny and it came out wrong. You are being incredibly unfair by refusing to even discuss this with us." I stopped walking but did not move toward her, maintaining physical distance that mirrored the emotional boundary I was establishing. "Mom," I said calmly, "I sent a clear message about my boundaries. I am not interested in debating whether Dad's words were intended to be hurtful. The impact was hurtful regardless of intent, and it was simply the most recent example of patterns that have been operating throughout my entire life. I need you to respect my decision and leave." She began crying in earnest then, and I felt the familiar pull of guilt and obligation that had controlled me for so many years. But I also recognized it as a manipulation tactic, whether conscious or unconscious, designed to make me prioritize her feelings over my own well-being. "I cannot believe you would do this to me," she said through tears. "After everything I have done for you, after all the sacrifices your father and I made to give you opportunities, this is how you repay us? By accusing us of terrible things and cutting us out of your life?" I felt anger rise up to meet the guilt, and I allowed myself to speak from that anger rather than from the accommodating people-pleasing pattern I was trying to break. "What sacrifices did you make for me specifically, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the emotion behind it. "You paid for my education the same way you paid for Daniel's, except he dropped out after one semester while I completed both undergraduate and graduate degrees. You provided housing during my childhood the same way you provided it for Daniel. But beyond those basic parental obligations that you chose when you decided to have children, what have you actually done for me that I should be so grateful for? Have you celebrated my achievements? Have you shown interest in my work or my life? Have you treated me with the same respect and pride that you have consistently shown Daniel? Or have you simply expected me to be available for whatever you needed while receiving nothing in return except criticism and dismissal?" My mother looked genuinely shocked, as if I had said something incomprehensible rather than simply stating obvious facts about our relationship. "You have always been so difficult," she said finally, her voice shifting from tears to something harder. "So sensitive and demanding. Daniel has always been easy to love because he does not keep score or throw our failures as parents back in our faces. Maybe if you had been more pleasant and less critical, you would have gotten the relationship with us that you apparently wanted. Her words confirmed everything I had come to understand during my week of reflection. In her construction of reality, I was difficult because I noticed differential treatment and had needs that I expected to be met. Daniel was easy because he required nothing from them emotionally while accepting everything they offered. The fact that Daniel required nothing because he was already receiving everything did not factor into her analysis. She had revealed her fundamental belief that children should be grateful for whatever parents chose to provide, and should never expect equitable treatment or genuine interest as a basic standard of relationship. I need you to leave now, I repeated more firmly this time. I am not going to continue this conversation. If you do not leave, I will call the building security and have you removed from the property. I am serious about my boundaries, and showing up at my home uninvited is a violation of those boundaries that makes me less likely, not more likely, to have any future contact with you. She stared at me for a long moment, perhaps waiting for me to soften or apologize or show some sign that I was conflicted about my position. When I remained silent and steady, she finally got back into her car and drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot feeling shaky, but also stronger than I had felt in years. I had maintained my boundary under direct pressure. I had named manipulation tactics rather than being controlled by them. I had prioritized my own well-being over my mother's comfort. These were small victories, perhaps, but they represented a fundamental shift in how I understood my right to take up space and have expectations in relationships. That night, I called Jessica and recounted the encounter. After I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You did exactly the right thing," she said firmly. "Your mother was testing whether your boundaries were real or whether you would fold under pressure. You showed her that the boundaries are real, and that violating them has consequences. She will probably try again, possibly with increased intensity, but each time you maintain your position despite pressure, you are reinforcing that these boundaries are non-negotiable. It gets easier with practice, and it sounds like you are already getting stronger at this." Her words proved accurate over the following weeks as my family made additional attempts to pressure me back into the fold. But each time they tested my boundaries, I maintained them, and each time I maintained them despite difficulty, I became more confident that I had made the right decision. I was learning that I did not need their approval or understanding to live according to my values. I simply needed the courage to consistently choose my own well-being. Even when that choice disappointed or angered people I had spent my life trying to please. That lesson, once learned, would change everything about how I moved through the world and what I accepted in my relationships. The establishment of clear boundaries with my family created unexpected space in my life that I had not anticipated. The constant low-level anxiety that had characterized my existence for as long as I could remember began to dissipate, replaced by a kind of quiet that felt both unfamiliar and deeply restorative. I found myself sleeping better, waking without the immediate dread of checking my phone for family emergencies or demands. My appetite returned to normal patterns after years of stress-related digestive issues that I had attributed to work pressures, but was now recognizing as manifestations of family-induced anxiety. Even my colleagues at the agency commented that I seemed different, more relaxed and present, though most of them did not know the details of what had transpired with my family. 3 weeks after sending my boundary-setting message, I sat down with my personal financial records to conduct an assessment that I had been avoiding for years. As a social worker who regularly helped clients develop budgets and financial stability plans, I possess both the skills and the professional obligation to maintain my own financial health. Yet I had been operating with a kind of willful blindness about the true state of my finances, particularly regarding the extent to which my family's demands had impacted my ability to build savings and work toward long-term financial goals. I opened a spreadsheet and began entering data from my bank statements, credit card records, and the various digital payment platforms I used. I went back 5 years, which was as far as my easily accessible records extended, though I knew the pattern stretched back much further. I created categories for different types of expenses, separating my legitimate personal costs from money that had flowed to family members in various forms. The process took several hours and required me to review hundreds of transactions, but the resulting picture was both clarifying and infuriating. Over the past 5 years, I had transferred a total of $23,400 directly to my brother Daniel for what he had characterized as short-term loans to cover business expenses, personal emergencies, or temporary cash flow gaps. Not a single dollar had been repaid despite his repeated assurances that repayment would occur once his current venture stabilized or his next investment paid off. I found additional expenses related to Daniel that had been less direct but equally real. I had paid for his portion of family gifts when he claimed to be temporarily short on funds, covered his share of restaurant bills when we dined together because he had forgotten his wallet or his card had been declined, and purchased various items he needed with promises of reimbursement that never materialized. The transfers to my parents followed different patterns but were equally substantial. My mother had requested financial assistance 16 times over the 5-year period, always framing the requests as urgent needs that she was embarrassed to mention but could not manage without help. The amounts ranged from $300 to help cover an unexpected veterinary bill for their dog to $2,000 for home repairs that supposedly could not wait, and that insurance had not covered. My father had made fewer direct requests but had regularly suggested that I contribute to family gatherings, vacation rentals that I might not even attend, or gifts for extended family members that he and my mother wanted to give but preferred not to pay for entirely themselves. I calculated the total amount that had flowed from my accounts to my family members over 5 years, and stared at the number with a mixture of shock and resignation. $41,700. Nearly $42,000 that I had earned through emotionally demanding work with vulnerable populations, transferred to family members who had substantially more financial resources than I did, and who had provided nothing in return except continued dismissal of my worth and occasional acknowledgement of my usefulness when they needed something. I thought about what that money could have meant for my own financial security. I could have paid off my remaining student loans entirely and been debt-free. I could have saved a substantial down payment for a home purchase rather than continuing to rent an apartment. I could have built an emergency fund that would have provided genuine security and reduced my constant low-level financial anxiety. I could have traveled, pursued additional training and certifications that would advance my career, or simply had the freedom that comes from knowing you have financial cushion to weather unexpected circumstances. Instead, that money had disappeared into the black hole of my family's wants and perceived needs, funding my brother's failed business ventures and my parents' lifestyle choices, while I struggled to cover my own basic expenses and worried about unexpected costs like car repairs or medical bills. The injustice of it was overwhelming once I allowed myself to see it clearly. They had characterized me as a financial burden, an expense that generated no returns, while simultaneously extracting tens of thousands of dollars from me under various pretenses. I expanded my analysis to include non-financial costs that were harder to quantify but equally real. I calculated the hours I had spent providing free emotional labor to family members, listening to my mother's complaints about her life while she showed no interest in mine, helping my father with technology issues that he could have paid someone to address, offering advice and support to Daniel regarding business decisions that he ultimately ignored while blaming external factors for his continued failures. I estimated conservatively that I had spent at least 5 hours per week over the past 5 years providing various forms of unpaid labor to family members, totaling approximately 1,300 hours. At my professional hourly rate, that time was worth over $50,000 in billable services that I had provided for free to people who not only failed to appreciate those services but actively denigrated my professional expertise and accomplishments. The financial reckoning clarified something essential about my family dynamics. They had needed me to remain in a subordinate position not despite my competence but because of it. My actual capabilities threatened their narrative about family hierarchy and about Daniel's supposed superiority. By keeping me financially drained through constant requests and by dismissing my professional accomplishments, they maintained a story where Daniel was the successful child despite objective evidence to the contrary, and where I was the struggling child despite my actual achievements and stability. The financial exploitation was not incidental to the emotional manipulation, but rather integral to maintaining the family system that served their psychological needs. I created a second spreadsheet projecting my financial future under 2 different scenarios. The first scenario assumed I continued my previous patterns of responding to family requests and absorbing various costs associated with maintaining family relationships. The second scenario assumed I maintained my new boundaries and redirected money previously flowing to family members toward my own financial goals. The difference was staggering. Within 2 years of maintaining boundaries, I could be completely debt-free with a substantial emergency fund. Within 5 years, I could have a down payment for a home, and be making significant contributions to retirement accounts that had been neglected during my years of subsidizing my family's lifestyle. The financial analysis provided concrete evidence that my decision to establish boundaries was not only emotionally healthy, but practically necessary for my long-term well-being and security. I had been sacrificing my own financial future to fund my family's present, receiving nothing in return except continued exploitation and criticism. The pattern could not continue if I had any hope of building the kind of stable, secure life that would allow me to continue doing meaningful work without the constant stress of financial precarity. That evening, I received an email from my father that departed from his previous pattern of demanding contact or insisting I was overreacting. The subject line read, "Important family matter requiring your immediate attention," and I opened it with some trepidation, uncertain what new tactic this might represent. The email was longer than his previous communications, and adopted a tone that attempted to sound reasonable and businesslike, rather than emotional or demanding. He wrote that Daniel was preparing to launch his newest venture, a technology platform that would supposedly revolutionize some aspect of personal finance management. The details were vague, as they always were with Daniel's projects, but my father emphasized the tremendous potential and the solid business plan that Daniel had developed. The venture required an initial capital investment of $150,000, which my father and several other family investors were prepared to provide. However, they were short by $20,000, and my father was writing to offer me the opportunity to invest in what he characterized as a certain success that would generate substantial returns within 18 months. I read the email 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of audacity and delusion. My father was asking me to invest $20,000, nearly half of what my family had extracted from me over the past 5 years, in my brother's 5th or 6th business venture, despite the fact that every previous venture had failed completely. He was framing this request as an opportunity and a favor to me, suggesting that I would benefit from the returns on this investment, and that my participation would demonstrate my commitment to family and my belief in Daniel's abilities. He concluded by noting that he needed my response within 1 week, as the funding timeline was tight, and other potential investors were waiting to see if the family would fully fund the venture before committing their own resources. The email was so perfectly representative of my family's dysfunction that I almost laughed. My father had heard nothing I said in my boundary-setting message. He had not acknowledged the patterns of exploitation I had named. He had not apologized for his public humiliation of me, or for the years of differential treatment. Instead, he had waited a few weeks and then returned with another financial request, this one substantially larger than any previous ask, framed in language designed to manipulate me through appeal to family loyalty and fear of missing a lucrative opportunity. I forwarded the email to Jessica without comment, curious about her professional assessment. She called me within 30 minutes, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This is financial abuse," she said bluntly. "I know that is a strong term and I do not use it lightly, but this is textbook financial exploitation of an adult family member. They have extracted over $40,000 from you over 5 years with no repayment. They have publicly characterized you as a financial burden, while privately treating you as an ATM. And now they are asking for $20,000 to fund your brother's business venture, knowing that you make a fraction of what they earn, and that you have received nothing but criticism in return for your previous financial support. This is not okay, Claire. This is genuinely abusive behavior dressed up in the language of family obligation and investment opportunity." Her characterization was accurate, and I needed to hear it stated so clearly by someone with professional expertise in family dysfunction. I had been minimizing the severity of the financial exploitation by telling myself that families help each other, and that perhaps I was being selfish for resenting the requests. But Jessica was right. This was not mutual aid within a family system. This was one-directional extraction from the family member least able to afford it, justified through manipulation and maintained through guilt. I spent that evening drafting a response to my father's email. I went through numerous versions, trying to find language that was clear and firm without being inflammatory or providing ammunition that could be used to characterize me as bitter or irrational. The final version was brief and direct. I wrote that I would not be investing in Daniel's venture, or providing any financial support to family members for any purpose going forward. I noted that over the past 5 years I had transferred over $40,000 to family members, none of which had been repaid despite promises to the contrary, and that this pattern of financial exploitation was one of the primary reasons I had established boundaries with the family. I stated clearly that I needed to prioritize my own financial security and long-term stability, particularly given that I worked in a helping profession that would never generate the kind of income that my father and Daniel had access to through their chosen fields. I concluded by reiterating my request that family members not contact me except for genuine emergencies, and that I would not be responding to further requests for money, time, or emotional labor. Before sending the email, I did something that felt both petty and deeply satisfying. I attached a spreadsheet showing every transfer I had made to family members over the past 5 years, including dates, amounts, and the stated purpose of each transfer. I included a column showing promised repayment dates where applicable and another column showing actual repayments, which was entirely blank. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, I included the total amount transferred and a calculation showing what that money could have accomplished for my own financial goals if I had invested it in my own future rather than in their wants. The spreadsheet was a visual representation of everything I had been articulating in words, concrete evidence that the family narrative about my being a financial burden was not only inaccurate but actually inverted. I was not the one costing them money. They were the ones who had been extracting money from me for years, while simultaneously criticizing my career choices and dismissing my accomplishments. The data was irrefutable and I wanted them to see it clearly, not because I expected them to acknowledge it or apologize, but because I needed to know that I had presented the truth without ambiguity. I sent the email with the attached spreadsheet, and then blocked my father's email address, so that I would not see his immediate response. I knew the response would be some combination of outrage at my audacity in documenting their requests, denial that the pattern I had identified was actually exploitative, and possibly threats about consequences for my continued refusal to participate in family expectations. I did not need to read those predictable reactions because they would not change anything about my decision or my assessment of the situation. The following day at work, I met with a client who was working to establish boundaries with her own financially exploitative family members. She was a young woman, barely 25, who was trying to break free from parents who had been using her credit cards and taking loans in her name without permission, destroying her credit score and leaving her with debt she had not incurred. As we worked together on developing a safety plan and connecting her with legal resources, I found myself drawing on my own recent experiences in ways that made me more effective in helping her see her situation clearly and believe that she deserved better treatment. During our session, she said something that stayed with me long after she left my office. She told me that the hardest part of establishing boundaries was not the practical aspects of blocking phone numbers or closing joint accounts, but rather accepting that her parents loved their access to her resources more than they loved her as a person. Once she accepted that painful truth, the practical steps became much easier because she was no longer fighting against her own hope that they would change or her own belief that she owed them something despite their behavior. Her words articulated something I had been circling around in my own process. My family loved what I could provide for them more than they loved me as a complete person with my own needs, goals, and right to equitable treatment. They valued my usefulness, my availability, my willingness to absorb criticism without complaint, and my function as the family member whose struggles made Daniel's mediocrity look like success by comparison. But they did not value me, not in any meaningful sense of that word. And once I truly accepted that reality, maintaining boundaries became not a matter of being strong enough to withstand their pressure, but rather a matter of basic self-preservation and self-respect. That weekend, I took the financial projections I had created and began implementing concrete plans based on the assumption that I would maintain my boundaries permanently. I opened a high-yield savings account and set up automatic transfers from each paycheck, building the emergency fund I should have had years ago. I contacted my student loan servicer and established an aggressive repayment plan that would have me debt-free within 18 months. I scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor who specialized in helping people and helping professions build long-term security despite modest incomes. Each action represented a commitment to my own future and a rejection of the pattern where my resources flowed to family members who neither needed nor appreciated them. I also did something that felt symbolic but important. I calculated what my family currently owed me if I treated the $41,000 as loans that should be repaid rather than gifts that had been freely given. With reasonable interest over the time periods involved, the amount came to nearly $50,000. I drafted a formal letter noting the amounts owed, including the detailed spreadsheet, and stating clearly that I expected repayment within 90 days. I did not send the letter because I had no expectation that it would result in actual repayment, and because I did not want to invite further contact or conflict. But I printed it, signed it, and filed it with my other important documents. If my family ever attempted to claim that I was the one who had been financially supported by them, or if they tried to use finances as leverage in any future interactions, I had documentation ready to counter their narrative with facts. The financial reckoning was painful but necessary. It transformed my understanding of the family dynamics from abstract patterns of emotional manipulation to concrete evidence of exploitation with real monetary costs. It provided justification for boundaries that went beyond hurt feelings or personality conflicts to fundamental issues of fairness and respect. And it clarified that my decision to disengage from my family was not only emotionally healthy but financially essential if I had any hope of building the secure, stable life that would allow me to continue doing work I found meaningful without constantly operating from a position of precarity and stress. The numbers told a story that words alone could not convey, and that story made clear that I was not abandoning my family but rather finally belatedly choosing myself after 3 decades of putting their wants ahead of my needs. The establishment of firm boundaries with my family coincided unexpectedly with significant developments in my professional life, creating a confluence of circumstances that would ultimately demonstrate to me what my family had never been able to see: that my career choices and accomplishments had genuine value that existed entirely independent of their recognition or approval. The timing was not coincidental in the sense of being planned, but it was meaningful in ways that provided external validation at precisely the moment when I most needed reassurance that I had made correct decisions about prioritizing my own well-being over family expectations. For weeks after my financial reckoning and the email to my father documenting the money I had transferred to family members over the years, I received an unexpected phone call from the executive director of our agency, Margaret Chen. Margaret was a woman in her early 60s who had spent her entire career in social services, building a reputation for transforming struggling agencies into effective organizations that delivered meaningful outcomes for vulnerable populations. She had been with our agency for 3 years, implementing systems and securing funding that had stabilized our operations and expanded our capacity to serve clients. I respected her tremendously both for her strategic vision and for her genuine commitment to the mission rather than simply the administrative aspects of leadership. Margaret asked if I could meet with her that afternoon for a conversation about my future with the organization. The request was unusual enough to trigger some anxiety, though her tone had been warm rather than ominous. I spent the hours before our scheduled meeting alternating between focused work with clients and distracted speculation about what she might want to discuss. When I finally knocked on her office door at the appointed time, she greeted me with a smile that immediately reduced my concerns about this being a negative conversation. She gestured for me to sit in one of the comfortable chairs arranged near her desk and began speaking without preamble, a directness I appreciated given my elevated anxiety. The agency had recently been awarded a substantial grant from a family foundation interested in innovative approaches to preventing family separation and supporting reunification when children had been removed from homes due to abuse or neglect. The grant was for 3 years with possibility of renewal, and it included funding for a new position that would design, implement, and evaluate a program integrating trauma-informed care principles with practical support services for families involved in the child welfare system. Margaret explained that she had been considering various candidates for this new position, both internal and external, and that I was her first choice for the role. She had observed my work with families over the years I had been with the agency and had consistently been impressed by my ability to build trust with even the most resistant clients, my skill in helping families identify and address root causes of dysfunction, rather than simply managing symptoms, and my commitment to treating every family with dignity regardless of the circumstances that had brought them to our services. The new position would involve program development, training other staff in the approaches we would be implementing, community outreach to build partnerships with other service providers, and direct clinical work with families in the pilot program. The position came with a substantial increase in salary, approximately $18,000 more annually than my current compensation, along with the title change to program director, and increased autonomy in how I structured my work. Margaret noted that the role would require additional responsibilities including grant reporting, supervision of other clinicians who would join the program as it expanded, and regular presentation of outcomes to the foundation funding the work. She wanted to know if I would be interested in the position, and if so, whether I could begin transitioning into the role within the next month. I sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing what she had just offered me. This was not a minor promotion or a token gesture of appreciation. This was recognition that my skills and approach had value beyond my individual client work, that my perspective was worth building an entire program around, that I had demonstrated competence worthy of increased responsibility and compensation. It was everything my family had never seen in my work, articulated by someone who actually understood what effective practice looked like and who had the professional standing to make that assessment credibly. I accepted the position immediately, trying to maintain professional composure, while feeling overwhelming emotion rising in my chest. Margaret smiled and told me that she had hoped I would say yes, that she had already begun having preliminary conversations with the foundation about my qualifications and approach, and that they were enthusiastic about having someone with my background and skills leading the program. We spent the next hour discussing the specifics of the role, the timeline for implementation, and the support I would need to be successful in this expanded capacity. As I walked back to my office after the meeting, I found myself thinking about the timing of this opportunity. 1 month earlier, I would have immediately called my parents to share the news, hoping that this substantial professional recognition might finally earn their pride or acknowledgement. I would have framed it in terms I thought they would value, emphasizing the salary increase and the leadership title rather than the meaningful aspects of the work itself. And I would have been devastated when their response was perfunctory, or when they redirected conversation to Daniel's activities without exploring what this promotion meant for me or my career trajectory. But now, having established boundaries and having done the painful work of accepting that my family would never provide the validation I had been seeking, I felt only pure satisfaction in the achievement itself. The promotion was meaningful because it represented recognition from people whose opinions I respected, because it would allow me to have greater impact on families and systems, and because it would provide financial stability that would accelerate my progress toward the goals I had identified during my financial reckoning. Whether my family ever knew about this achievement or acknowledged it was entirely irrelevant to its value. I did tell Jessica immediately, walking to her office with barely contained excitement to share the news. Her response was everything I could have hoped for. Genuine celebration, detailed questions about the program and my vision for it, and clear articulation of why I was the right person for this role, and why this promotion was both deserved and likely to lead to even greater opportunities as I demonstrated what I was capable of when given resources and autonomy. We went out after work to celebrate, and she toasted to my success and to the fact that I had finally extracted myself from relationships that prevented me from fully appreciating my own accomplishments. The following week, as I began transitioning into my new role and working with Margaret on the detailed program design, I received an email from Daniel. The subject line read, "Dad told me about your email," and I opened it with some trepidation, unsure whether this would be another attempt at manipulation or something different. The email was longer than Daniel's typical communications, and had a tone that seemed to be aiming for reasonable and conciliatory, rather than defensive or demanding. Daniel wrote that our father had forwarded him my email, and the attached spreadsheet documenting the money I had transferred to family members over the years. He claimed to be shocked by the total amount and by my characterization of these transfers as exploitation rather than normal family support. He acknowledged that he had borrowed money from me on multiple occasions and that he had not repaid those loans, but he framed this as an oversight rather than intentional exploitation. He suggested that he had always intended to repay me, and had simply lost track of the amounts and timeline given everything else he was managing with his various business ventures. The email continued with Daniel proposing what he characterized as a fair resolution. He offered to repay me $3,000 immediately as a gesture of good faith, and to establish a payment plan for the remaining amount he owed, suggesting monthly payments of $500 until the debt was cleared. He noted that this repayment plan would require him to make some adjustments to his lifestyle and business investments, but that he recognized I had legitimate grounds to expect repayment, and he wanted to do right by me. He concluded by suggesting that once the financial matters were resolved, Perhaps we could work on rebuilding our relationship and I could reconsider my decision to cut off contact with the family. I read the email 3 times, analyzing it with the professional skills I had developed through years of assessing whether clients were genuinely committed to change or simply performing compliance to avoid consequences. Daniel's email had several revealing characteristics. First, he had been shocked by the total amount only when it was presented to him in aggregate form, suggesting that he had never actually tracked or cared about how much he was taking from me as long as I kept providing it. Second, he characterized his failure to repay as an oversight, a framing that absolved him of responsibility and suggested the problem was memory rather than values or priorities. Third, his offer to repay represented only a fraction of what he actually owed me, with the $3,000 immediate payment being less than 15% of his total debt, and the proposed payment plan stretching repayment over multiple years during which time his circumstances could change and payments could cease. Most significantly, Daniel was still framing the financial exploitation as the primary issue and suggesting that resolving it would address my concerns about our relationship. He had not acknowledged the emotional manipulation, the differential treatment by our parents, the public humiliation at the retirement dinner, or any of the other patterns I had identified in my boundary-setting message. He was treating this as a financial transaction that could be negotiated and settled, rather than as a fundamental relationship dysfunction that money could not resolve. I considered various possible responses before deciding that the most appropriate one was minimal engagement. I replied briefly that I appreciated his acknowledgement that he owed me money, but that I was not interested in establishing a payment plan or in rebuilding our relationship. I noted that the financial exploitation was a symptom of larger patterns rather than the core issue, and that those larger patterns remained unaddressed in his email and in the family system more broadly. I concluded by stating that he should consider the debt forgiven if repayment would genuinely create hardship, as I did not want money from him more than I wanted clear boundaries and permanent distance from family dynamics that had been harmful to me. The decision to forgive the debt was not about generosity toward Daniel, but rather about freeing myself from any ongoing connection or obligation. If he owed me money and was making payments, that created an ongoing relationship and potential source of conflict or guilt. If I forgave the debt entirely, I eliminated any reason for continued contact and any claim he might make that I was being unfair, or that he was making efforts to address my concerns. The debt forgiveness was a strategic boundary-setting tool, rather than an act of reconciliation. That same week, I was invited to present at a regional conference for child welfare professionals about my approach to working with families involved in the system. The invitation came through Margaret, who had been asked to recommend presenters, and had immediately suggested me based on outcomes I had achieved with families that other workers had characterized as hopeless or resistant to services. The conference was in 6 weeks and would bring together social workers, judges, attorneys and administrators from across the state to discuss best practices and innovative approaches. I spent my evenings over the following weeks preparing a presentation that would articulate not just what I did with families, but why those approaches were effective, and how they could be adapted by other professionals working in similar contexts. The preparation process required me to examine my own practice systematically, identifying the principles and techniques that seem to generate positive outcomes and distinguishing those evidence-based approaches from idiosyncratic elements that might not translate to other workers or settings. As I worked through this analysis, I found myself appreciating my own clinical judgment and skills in ways I had not previously allowed myself to fully acknowledge. The presentation at the conference exceeded my expectations in terms of both attendance and engagement. My session was scheduled in one of the smaller breakout rooms based on the assumption that the topic would appeal to a specialized audience, but the room filled beyond capacity with people standing along the walls and sitting on the floor. I presented for 45 minutes, walking through case examples, articulating principles of trauma-informed practice, and discussing how to build trust with families who had experienced systematic betrayal by systems that were supposed to help them. The question and answer period extended well beyond the scheduled time, as attendees asked increasingly sophisticated questions about application in various contexts, and about how to address systemic barriers to implementing these approaches. After the formal session ended, multiple attendees approached me to continue conversations about the work, to ask for recommendations about resources and training, and to express appreciation for the presentation. Several people mentioned that they had been working in child welfare for decades, and had become somewhat cynical about the possibility of meaningful change, but that my presentation had reminded them why they had entered the field and had given them concrete strategies they could implement immediately. A family court judge who had attended the session told me that she wished every social worker who appeared in her courtroom approached cases with the perspective and skills I had demonstrated, and she asked for my contact information so she could refer attorneys and families to resources I had mentioned. The professional recognition at the conference created opportunities one had not anticipated. Over the following weeks, I received invitations to consult with other agencies about program development, to provide training for their staff, and to collaborate on grant applications for funding similar initiatives. Each invitation represented both validation of my expertise and potential for additional income through consulting work that could be done outside my primary employment. The consulting opportunities would allow me to accelerate my financial goals, while also expanding my influence beyond my immediate agency and client population. I found myself thinking about the contrast between this professional trajectory and my family's assessment of my career as evidence of limited ambition or wasted potential. To them, social work represented a failure to capitalize on my education and abilities, a choice that prioritized feeling good over earning well, and a career path that would never generate the kind of success they valued. But to the professionals whose opinions actually mattered in my field, I was demonstrating exactly the kind of expertise and leadership that distinguished exceptional practitioners from those who were merely competent. The recognition I was receiving was based on demonstrated outcomes and articulated knowledge rather than on performance or appearance, and it came from people who understood what effective practice actually required. 6 weeks after the conference presentation, Margaret called me into her office for another conversation. The foundation funding our new program had been so impressed by the preliminary outcomes and by reports from other agencies about my consultation work that they wanted to expand the grant to include a training and technical assistance component. They were prepared to provide additional funding that would allow me to spend a portion of my time developing training curricula, delivering workshops to other agencies, and providing ongoing consultation to programs implementing similar approaches. The expanded grant would bring additional salary increase and would position me as a regional expert on trauma-informed family services. Margaret emphasized that this expanded role was contingent on my interest and my assessment of whether I could manage the additional responsibilities while maintaining the quality of the direct program work. She did not want me to feel pressured to accept responsibilities that would lead to burnout or that would compromise the aspects of the work I found most meaningful. Her concern for my well-being and her respect for my judgment about what I could manage stood in stark contrast to my family's pattern of making demands without regard for my capacity or needs. I accepted the expanded role while also negotiating for additional administrative support that would allow me to delegate some of the routine aspects of program management and focus my time on the clinical and training work where I had the most to contribute. The negotiation itself was empowering, requiring me to advocate for what I needed rather than simply accepting whatever was offered and then struggling to make it work. Margaret responded positively to my requests, appreciating that I was thinking strategically about sustainability, rather than simply agreeing to everything and burning out within a year. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and reflected on the dramatic changes in my professional life over the past 2 months. The promotion, the conference presentation, the consulting opportunities, the expanded grant, all of these developments had occurred during the same period when I had been establishing boundaries with my family and processing the grief of accepting that they would never provide the recognition I had sought from them. The timing suggested something important about the relationship between the two processes. For years, I had been pouring enormous energy into trying to earn my family's validation, while that same energy could have been directed toward professional development and strategic career advancement. I had been operating with a scarcity mindset, believing that I needed to accept whatever my family was willing to give me because I was somehow not worthy of better treatment. That mindset had kept me small professionally as well as personally, hesitant to pursue opportunities or advocate for myself because some part of me believed my family's assessment that I was disappointing and limited. But extracting myself from those toxic dynamics had freed resources, both psychological and practical, that I could redirect toward building the kind of life and career I actually wanted. Without the constant drain of managing family crises and absorbing their criticism, I had energy to invest in professional growth. Without the underlying belief that I was somehow inadequate, I could pursue opportunities with confidence rather than apologetic hesitation. The professional vindication was not happening despite my family estrangement but rather because of it, because I had finally created space for my actual capabilities to become visible and to be developed fully. I thought about my father's statement at the retirement dinner about investments and expenses, about children who generated returns versus children who simply cost money. By his metrics, which valued financial success and conventional markers of achievement, perhaps I had been an expense. But by metrics that actually mattered, metrics that measured impact and contribution and alignment between values and actions, I was succeeding in ways he would never understand or appreciate. And his inability to see that success was his limitation, not my failure. The professional recognition I was receiving came from people who understood what meaningful work looked like, and who had the expertise to assess it accurately. Their validation mattered infinitely more than his ever could, and I was finally, belatedly, allowing myself to believe that. The professional recognition and financial stability I had been building over the previous 2 months created a foundation of security that allowed me to maintain my boundaries with my family, even as they escalated their attempts to restore the previous dynamics. What I had not anticipated was that my extraction from the family system would create ripple effects that extended beyond my individual relationships with parents and brother, destabilizing patterns that had apparently been more dependent on my participation than I had realized. The family system that had organized itself around certain roles and hierarchies began to fracture when one of its essential components refused to continue playing the assigned part. The first indication that my absence was creating broader disruption came through an unexpected phone call from my Aunt Rebecca, my mother's younger sister, who had been present at the retirement dinner but had remained largely silent during the subsequent conflicts. Rebecca and I had never been particularly close, our relationship characterized by pleasant exchanges at family gatherings but minimal contact between those occasions. She called on a Thursday evening approximately 10 weeks after I had walked out of the retirement celebration, and her voice carried a tension that suggested this was not a casual social call. Rebecca began by acknowledging that she had received my boundary-setting message, and had understood from it that I did not want family members contacting me except for genuine emergencies. She apologized for violating that boundary but suggested that what she needed to discuss qualified as a situation I would want to know about even if it was not an emergency in the traditional sense. Her tone was respectful rather than manipulative, which made me willing to hear what she had to say rather than immediately ending the call. She explained that my withdrawal from the family had apparently triggered a series of conflicts and revelations that were now affecting multiple family relationships beyond my immediate connections with parents and brother. My mother had become increasingly volatile and difficult to be around, alternating between tearful expressions of victimhood and angry tirades about my ingratitude and cruelty. During one such tirade at a family gathering I had not attended, my mother had apparently said things about Rebecca's own life choices and parenting decisions that Rebecca found deeply hurtful and offensive. When Rebecca attempted to address these comments, my mother had responded with accusations that Rebecca had always been jealous of her marriage and lifestyle, had never appreciated the support my parents had provided to extended family, and was probably encouraging my rebellious behavior because she resented the family hierarchy. The confrontation had escalated to the point where Rebecca and her husband had left the gathering early, and subsequent attempts to discuss the situation had been unsuccessful because my mother refused to acknowledge that she had said anything inappropriate or hurtful. Rebecca told me that she had been reflecting on family dynamics more carefully since that incident and had begun recognizing patterns she had previously overlooked or excused. She was calling partly to apologize for not speaking up at the retirement dinner when my father had made his cruel comments about investments and expenses, and partly to let me know that I was not alone in finding the family's treatment of certain members to be problematic and harmful. I listened to Rebecca's account with interest and some validation, though I was cautious about how much to invest in this conversation. It was possible that Rebecca was genuinely experiencing her own awakening about family dysfunction, or it was possible that she was being deployed by other family members to create an opening for reconciliation by positioning herself as someone who understood my perspective. I thanked her for the call and for the apology regarding the dinner, but I did not immediately embrace her as an ally or share detailed information about my experiences and decision-making process. Rebecca seemed to understand my caution, and did not push for more engagement than I was willing to offer. She concluded the call by saying that she respected my boundaries and would not contact me again unless I reached out to her first, but that she wanted me to know that I had family members who were beginning to question the dominant narratives and who recognized that the treatment I had received was neither fair nor justified. The call ended on that note, leaving me with complicated feelings about what this development might mean for the broader family system, and for my own position within or outside that system. 2 weeks after Rebecca's call, I received a much less welcome contact from my Uncle Thomas, my father's older brother, who had been at the retirement dinner and who had subsequently sent me messages encouraging me to reconcile and stop causing family discord. Thomas left a voicemail rather than calling during hours when I might actually answer, and his message had an aggressive edge that suggested he was angry rather than concerned. He stated that my behavior over the past 3 months had created serious problems for the family, and that I needed to understand the consequences of my selfish choices. Thomas explained in his voicemail that Daniel's newest business venture was collapsing because potential investors were hesitant to commit funding to a family business when there was obvious family conflict and dysfunction. Apparently, some investor who had been considering a substantial investment had learned about the estrangement and had expressed concerns about whether Daniel had the emotional stability and family support to successfully execute a demanding business plan. Without that investor's participation, Daniel could not secure the full funding he needed, and the venture was now in jeopardy. Thomas characterized this situation as a direct result of my refusal to reconcile with the family, suggesting that my stubborn maintenance of boundaries was actively sabotaging Daniel's opportunities and future success. The voicemail continued with Thomas asserting that I had responsibilities to the family that I was shirking, that my education and opportunities had been funded by the family, and therefore I owed loyalty and support even when I disagreed with specific decisions or communications. He concluded by saying that if Daniel's venture failed due to my refusal to present a united family front, I would be responsible for the financial and emotional consequences, and the family would remember my selfishness and betrayal. The message ended abruptly without any invitation for response or dialogue, suggesting it was intended as a threat, rather than a genuine attempt at communication. I saved the voicemail as documentation of the ongoing attempts at manipulation and boundary violation, but I did not respond to it in any form. The logic of Thomas's message was so profoundly flawed that engaging with it would give it more credibility than it deserved. The idea that potential investors would base funding decisions on whether a business owner had a harmonious relationship with the sibling was absurd. If investors were actually hesitant to fund Daniel's venture, it was almost certainly due to his track record of failure, his lack of sustainable business model, or concerns about his competence and follow-through rather than anything related to family dynamics they would have no way of knowing about unless Daniel had inappropriately shared that information during business discussions. Moreover, the suggestion that I was responsible for Daniel's business outcomes, simply by refusing to maintain relationships that were harmful to me, demonstrated the family's fundamental inability to assign responsibility appropriately. Daniel's success or failure was determined by his own choices, skills, and execution. My presence or absence from family events had exactly zero impact on whether his business model was sound, whether his financial projections were realistic, whether he had the discipline and knowledge to manage the operational details of running a company. The attempt to blame me for consequences that were actually the result of Daniel's own patterns revealed how deeply invested the family was in maintaining their preferred narrative regardless of objective reality. What struck me most about Thomas's voicemail was the barely concealed fury beneath his words. He was not simply disappointed or concerned about my choices. He was genuinely angry that I had disrupted the family system, angry in a way that seemed disproportionate to the situation unless my role in that system had been more important to its functioning than I had understood. I began to recognize that I had served purposes beyond simply being the disappointing child who made Daniel look good by comparison. I had also apparently been a stabilizing force, someone who absorbed family conflict and dysfunction without creating reciprocal drama, someone whose competence could be relied upon even while being dismissed, someone whose presence had allowed other family members to avoid dealing with their own issues by focusing on mine. My withdrawal had removed that stabilizing force, and the system was now exposed to pressures it had previously managed by redirecting them onto me. My mother could no longer vent her anxieties and insecurities by criticizing my choices because I was not available to absorb that criticism. My father could no longer feel successful as a parent by comparing Daniel's supposed potential to my supposedly limited achievements, because I was not present to serve as the negative reference point. Daniel could no longer avoid accountability for his failures by borrowing money from me, or by having the family focus on my shortcomings rather than his patterns. And the broader family could no longer maintain comfortable illusions about family harmony and functional relationships because my absence made the dysfunction impossible to ignore. I discussed these dynamics with Jessica during one of our regular coffee meetings, and she offered professional perspective that helped me understand what was happening in systems terms. She explained that families, like all systems, organize themselves around homeostasis, a state of equilibrium that may be dysfunctional, but that feels stable and predictable to system members. When one member of the system changes their behavior in significant ways, the system experiences that change as destabilizing and threatening. The other system members will typically escalate their efforts to pull the changing member back into their previous role, because that is easier than adapting the system itself to accommodate the change. Jessica noted that the escalation I was experiencing, the angry voicemails, the attempts to blame me for consequences that were not actually related to my choices, the recruitment of extended family members to pressure me, these were all predictable responses from a system trying to restore its previous equilibrium. She warned me that the pressure would likely continue to intensify before it decreased, and that I should prepare for the possibility of more extreme tactics, including attempts to interfere with my professional life, efforts to turn mutual friends against me, or even potential legal threats or actions if the family became desperate enough. Her warning proved prescient sooner than I anticipated. 3 days after my conversation with Jessica, I received an email from my supervisor Margaret asking if we could meet briefly about a matter that had come to her attention. The tone of the email was professional and calm, but the unusual timing and vague description of the topic created some anxiety. When I met with Margaret later that day, she explained that she had received a phone call from someone identifying himself as my father, expressing concerns about my mental health and professional judgment. According to Margaret's account, my father had told her that I was going through a difficult time emotionally, and had cut off contact with my family in a way that concerned them about my stability and well-being. He had suggested that I might be experiencing some kind of breakdown that was affecting my judgment, and he wondered whether the agency was aware of my situation and whether I was receiving appropriate support. He had framed his call as coming from a place of paternal concern rather than malice, but the implication was clear that he was questioning my fitness to perform my professional responsibilities. Margaret had handled the call exactly as I would have hoped, thanking my father for his concern but noting that my professional performance was excellent, that she had no concerns about my judgment or stability, and that any personal matters were private and not appropriate for her to discuss with family members without my explicit consent. She had documented the call according to agency policy, but had not considered it a serious concern given her direct knowledge of my work quality and professional demeanor. She was telling me about it primarily so that I was aware the contact had occurred, and so that I could provide any context that might be relevant if similar contacts happened in the future. I thanked Margaret for her professional handling of the situation, and for informing me about it. I provided brief context that I had recently established boundaries with my family due to ongoing dysfunction and exploitation, and that this call was apparently part of a pattern of escalating attempts to pressure me back into relationships that were not healthy for me. I did not go into extensive detail about the family dynamics because that was not professionally relevant, but I wanted Margaret to understand that any future contacts from family members should be understood as harassment rather than genuine concern. Margaret assured me that she understood the situation, and that any future contacts would be handled similarly, and would be documented in case we eventually needed to pursue formal harassment remedies. The attempt to interfere with my professional life represented a significant escalation, and a line being crossed that could not be uncrossed. My father had apparently decided that if he could not manipulate me directly through guilt or obligation, he would attempt to create professional consequences that might make me more amenable to reconciliation. The strategy was both transparent and deeply revealing about his character, and his understanding of appropriate boundaries. That he thought it was acceptable to contact my employer with false concerns about my mental health demonstrated a willingness to cause me real harm in service of restoring his preferred family dynamics. I consulted with Jessica about whether this incident warranted legal response, and she connected me with an attorney who specialized in family law and harassment cases. The attorney reviewed the documentation I had been keeping, including the voicemails, emails, the financial spreadsheet showing exploitation patterns, and now the incident of workplace contact. She advised that I had sufficient evidence to pursue a cease and desist letter that would create legal documentation of the harassment and would establish clear consequences if the behavior continued. The letter would not prevent future contact entirely, but it would demonstrate that I was serious about boundaries and that continued violation would result in formal legal action. I authorized the attorney to draft and send the cease and desist letter to my parents, Daniel and Thomas, the family members who had been most actively involved in boundary violations and harassment. The letter detailed specific incidents of unwanted contact, financial exploitation, and interference with my professional life. It demanded that these individuals cease all contact with me, except through written communication to my attorney regarding genuine legal matters or verified family emergencies. It specified that any future violations would result in pursuit of protective orders and potential civil action for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The cease and desist letter was delivered via certified mail to ensure documentation of receipt. I felt a complex mixture of emotions after authorizing it. There was relief at taking formal action that established clear boundaries with legal weight behind them. There was sadness at reaching a point where legal intervention was necessary to protect myself from my own family. There was also a kind of grim satisfaction in demonstrating that I was not the fragile, unstable person they had tried to characterize me as, but rather someone who understood my rights and was willing to enforce them through appropriate channels. The response to the cease and desist letter came not from my parents or brother directly but through an attorney they had apparently retained, suggesting they were taking the legal documentation seriously. Their attorney sent a response letter that characterized my allegations as exaggerated and motivated by emotional instability, but that committed his clients to respecting my request for no contact. The letter attempted to preserve my family's narrative that they had done nothing wrong while agreeing to the specific behavioral boundaries the cease and desist had established. It was a face-saving measure that allowed them to comply without admitting fault, and I was satisfied with that outcome because I cared about the behavior change rather than about forcing acknowledgement or apology. In the weeks following the cease and desist letter, the direct contact from my family members ceased almost entirely. I received no more voicemails, no more emails, no more attempts to show up at my workplace or apartment. The silence was initially strange after months of constant pressure, but it quickly became comfortable, and then deeply appreciated. I realized how much mental and emotional energy I had been expending simply managing and responding to their various attempts at manipulation and boundary violation. Without that constant drain, I had resources available for activities and relationships that actually enriched my life rather than depleting it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.